I put £525,000 into a business partnership in Bangkok. I lost £487,000 of it. That's not a typo. That's not a rounding error. That is £487,000 sterling, transferred in installments across 19 months into a joint venture that I now know was a phantom from the very first conversation. There was never a real business. There was never a real partnership. There was a script, a cast, a set of props, and I was the only person in the room who hadn't read it. People will hear this story and they'll say, "I should have known." They'll say the signs were obvious. Maybe they're right. Maybe from the outside, watching a 61-year-old retired business consultant hand over £500,000 to a woman he'd known for 7 months, it looks like the most preventable disaster in history. But I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I spent 35 years doing due diligence on commercial contracts. I built a consulting practice that helped companies avoid exactly this kind of exposure. I was not a romantic fool. I was not a desperate man looking for companionship at any cost. I was, or so I believed, a professional making a calculated investment in a legitimate opportunity with a credible partner. The fact that the partner happened to be a 32-year-old woman named Grace, and the fact that I was falling in love with her, those things felt separate to me at the time. I kept the 2 compartments sealed. Or I thought I had. I retired at 59. My wife and I had been divorced for 6 years by then. An amicable split, no bitterness on either side, just 2 people who'd grown into strangers while they weren't paying attention. I had a consulting firm in Manchester that I sold for a decent sum, enough to retire comfortably if I was sensible about it. My daughter was grown, living in Edinburgh with her own life. My son was in Canada. And I had, for the first time in 4 decades, absolutely nothing I was required to do. No clients, no deadlines, no board meetings. Just a very large, very quiet house in Cheshire that I'd rattled around in for 3 years, wondering what exactly I was supposed to be doing with the second half of my life. A former colleague of mine, a man called Neil, who'd done advisory work across Southeast Asia for 20 years, had been telling me about Bangkok since we'd worked together on a restructuring project in the early 2000s. He'd retired there himself, running a small consultancy from a service department in Asoke. And every time we spoke, he'd talk about the energy of the city, the pace of commerce, the opportunities for someone with the right background and the right capital to do something genuinely interesting. I wasn't listening for a long time. Then I was. I visited Bangkok for the first time in October 2019, a 2-week reconnaissance trip, and I'll admit the city got into me in a way I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the tourist version of Thailand I'd half expected. It was a functioning commercial metropolis, chaotic and electric, and full of people doing serious business. I stayed in a hotel on Sukhumvit Road, spent my days meeting the contacts Neil had arranged for me, walked the streets in the evenings watching the city operate, and by the time I boarded my flight home, I'd already decided I was coming back. The question was what I'd be coming back for. I met Grace in February 2020, 6 weeks into my second trip. I need to be precise about how this happened because people will assume it was some kind of social encounter, a bar, a hotel lobby, a chance meeting designed to feel coincidental. It wasn't. I met Grace at a business networking event in Sathon, organized by a British Thai Chamber of Commerce affiliate, which I'd attended specifically because Neil had suggested it as a way to meet legitimate local operators. She was there representing a trading company she'd co-founded with 2 partners, presenting a brief on import-export opportunities between Thailand and European markets. She spoke excellent English, carried herself with authority, answered questions from the floor without hesitation, and afterwards, when we were introduced through a mutual acquaintance, she asked me within the first 5 minutes about my background in commercial consulting with a specificity that suggested she'd done some research. I found that impressive rather than suspicious. In business, preparation is a virtue. We had dinner that same evening with a group of 6 others, and then a second dinner 2 days later with just the 2 of us, ostensibly to discuss a potential advisory arrangement. By the end of that dinner, the conversation had wandered far from business, and I think we both knew it. She was brilliant and funny and had a kind of focused intelligence that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I told myself repeatedly during those first weeks that I was keeping things professional. I was not keeping things professional. I was doing what 61-year-old men do when they meet 32-year-old women who pay them close and intelligent attention. I was falling for it. I want to be honest about that. I remember the restaurant where we had that second dinner. It was in a building on Siloam, one of those rooftop places, with the city spread out below you like something from a film. I ordered a fish dish I can't remember the name of, and she had what I think was a green curry, though I may be misremembering that part. What I do remember is that at some point during the meal, she looked at me very directly and said she'd been thinking about a different kind of joint venture, not just an advisory arrangement. A genuine partnership, co-investment, shared risk, and shared return. She said she'd been looking for a partner with European market knowledge and capital backing for 2 years, and that she hadn't found anyone she trusted until now. I don't know why that sentence landed the way it did. I've turned it over many times. But the combination of trusted and now, in that context, from that person, did something to my judgment that I should have recognized immediately. Grace's background, as she presented it to me across our first several weeks of conversations, was this. She'd grown up in Bangkok, middle-class family, father a civil engineer, mother who'd run a small garment business. She'd studied business administration at Chulalongkorn University, then spent 5 years working for a logistics company in the Bang Na area before co-founding her current trading operation. She had 2 business partners, both Thai, both of whom I would eventually meet, and both of whom I now understand to have been as central to the scheme as Grace herself. Her romantic history she gave me in pieces, carefully. A failed engagement to a Thai man when she was 25, no children, a brief relationship with an Australian businessman that had ended when he returned home. She spoke about money with a pragmatism that I found refreshing. She didn't pretend it didn't matter. She talked about capital and return and risk with the same directness I used myself. It felt like speaking the same language. Looking back, the first red flag was presented to me so elegantly that it registered as a green one. About 3 weeks after we'd begun spending significant time together, Grace mentioned that one of her business partners had recently withdrawn his investment from their joint operation, creating a short-term liquidity problem. Not a crisis, she was careful to say. A temporary gap. She wasn't asking me for anything. She was simply being transparent about the current state of the business, as a potential partner would be. I offered to look at the books. She said she'd appreciate that. The books I was shown were professionally prepared, showed a modestly profitable operation with consistent year-on-year growth, and the partner withdrawal was documented in a way that looked entirely legitimate. I later paid a significant sum to an accountant who confirmed that those documents were fabrications, but they were very good fabrications, and at the time they satisfied my professional skepticism entirely. The joint venture proposal that Grace eventually brought me in April 2020 was a detailed written document, 38 pages, including appendices, covering a proposed expansion of her trading operation into the distribution of European specialist consumer goods into the Thai and broader ASEAN market. The financials were thorough. The market analysis was credible. The proposed structure gave me a 49% equity stake, with Grace and her remaining partner holding the majority, which she framed as a legal necessity given Thai foreign business ownership laws. That part was genuinely true. The Foreign Business Act does restrict foreign majority ownership in most commercial categories. That's a real legal framework. She used real information as the scaffolding for an entirely false structure. I didn't know that yet. Neil warned me. I want to be honest about this too. Neil had dinner with Grace and me in March, and afterwards, walking back along the canal near his apartment in Asoke, he said something I've thought about nearly every day since. He said, "She's impressive. Maybe too impressive for this kind of deal." When someone's presentation is that polished, it usually means they've given it many times before. I laughed at that. I told him she was simply a professional woman who knew her business. He didn't push it. He just said to take my time and get independent legal verification of every document before committing. I told him I would. I got the legal verification on the company registration documents and the business accounts, both of which checked out because both of which were real, just not the version of the story Grace had told me. I didn't verify the things that would have mattered. I didn't investigate the partner who'd allegedly withdrawn. I didn't independently check the valuation of the existing business. I verified what Grace handed me and believed it proved what she said it proved. I'm telling you this in a fairly linear fashion, but I should say that when I lived through it, it didn't have this structure. It felt like a completely organic process. Business conversations and relationship conversations happened simultaneously. The legal paperwork and the personal milestones happened in parallel. I signed the initial joint venture agreement in May 2020, 4 months after we'd met, and I am aware of how that sounds. I am aware that 4 months is not sufficient time for due diligence at this scale. But the world was in a peculiar state in 2020, you'll remember, and the sense of existing in suspended time, of being elsewhere from your normal life, of all ordinary timelines having been compressed or distorted, that context is not irrelevant. The initial investment I committed under the agreement was £120,000, converted at the time to approximately 4.8 million baht. This was framed as working capital to support the first phase of the distribution operation, primarily warehouse costs and initial stock acquisition. I transferred the funds to a company account in July 2020. I was given documentation confirming receipt, and I received a report 3 weeks later showing that warehouse space had been secured in the Lat Krabang area near the Eastern Seaboard Industrial Zone. I drove to that warehouse with Grace in August. It existed. There were shelves. There were Thai men in uniforms walking around doing things that looked like inventory work. That warehouse was real. I don't know whose it was, but it existed, and for a brief period it served as physical evidence that the business was real. I moved permanently to Bangkok in September 2020. I was living in a rented apartment in the Ari area, which Grace had found for me, a nice building, 2 bedrooms, a small balcony looking out over the canal. She was spending most nights there within a month of my arrival. Her family situation she described to me gradually over the preceding months. A younger brother who worked in construction, 2 aunts in Nakhon Ratchasima, a cousin who helped with administrative work in the trading company. I had met her mother once, briefly, a small, quiet woman who spoke no English and smiled a great deal, and I had met her brother Chanit, who I remember as very pleasant and very tall, and who was introduced to me as a potential warehouse supervisor for the expanded operation. By November 2020, 6 months into the formal partnership, the business was producing documentation showing early-stage growth. Shipments were being tracked on reports Grace provided. There were invoices, purchase orders, shipping manifests. I reviewed these documents every month with what I believed was appropriate scrutiny. I was asking the right questions. I was getting answers that corresponded to documentation. The documentation was fabricated, of course, but it was fabricated by people who understood what professional documentation should look like. I've been in commercial consulting for 35 years. These people had studied people like me. They knew exactly what I'd look for, and they made sure I found it. The first call I got from the Bangkok bank corporate team came in December 2020. I want to be very specific about this moment, because it was, in retrospect, the moment at which I could have unraveled the whole thing. The caller was a relationship manager at the Siloam branch where the company account was held. He was calling, he said, to confirm some transaction details relating to a recent international transfer. The amount he mentioned did not correspond to any transaction I recognized. I told him that. There was a pause. He said he would look into it and call back. He didn't call back immediately. I mentioned the call to Grace that evening. She said it was probably a routine verification query, that the banking system in Thailand sometimes flags interbank transfers for compliance checks, and that she would call the branch manager directly to clarify. She presented this explanation with complete calm, and I accepted it with complete stupidity. The call was not followed up. I did not follow it up. I moved on. I should pause here and acknowledge something. I'm recounting these moments, and I can hear how they sound. I can hear the obvious question, which is why a man with my professional background and my stated skepticism kept moving forward. And the honest answer, the one I don't enjoy giving, is that by December 2020, I was in love with Grace in a way that had compromised my ability to apply professional standards to her specifically. I could evaluate documents. I couldn't evaluate her. They're different skills, and she understood that better than I did. That December, she told me her brother had been in an accident on a construction site. A scaffolding collapse, she said, 3 other men also injured, her brother with a broken pelvis that would require surgery and a long recovery period. The cost was significant. The company that employed him had minimal insurance. She mentioned this to me over dinner, not as a request, more as a worry she was sharing with her partner. I gave her 200,000 baht. At the time, roughly 4,000 pounds. I told myself this was the kind of support that partners give each other. I told myself that this was not the beginning of a pattern. I was wrong on the second point. January 2021 brought the proposal for the second phase of investment. The documentation Grace presented was even more professional than the original joint venture papers. Phase 2, as she called it, was an expansion into the retail distribution of health and wellness products, a segment she identified as showing substantial growth in the post-pandemic Thai consumer market. The additional investment required was 240,000 pounds. She had projected financials, market research, 3 letters of intent from Thai retail chains. The letters of intent were the best forgeries in the entire operation, I've since been told. They looked exactly right. They bore the correct logos and what appeared to be authentic signatures. I've subsequently had them assessed, and they were printed on paper that was close, but not identical to the actual stationery of those retail chains. I want to explain something about how I processed that investment decision, because this is where people will most strongly judge me. By January 2021, I had already invested 120,000 pounds, plus various smaller amounts that had accumulated to around 20,000 pounds. Withdrawing at that point would have meant losing that 140,000. Proceeding would mean risking an additional 240,000, but, according to the projections, potentially recovering everything and generating substantial returns. In commercial consulting, I had advised companies against this reasoning dozens of times. Sunk cost fallacy. Don't throw good money after bad. Every training session on investment decision-making covers this. I knew exactly what I was doing. I did it anyway. I told myself my situation was different because I had direct visibility into the operation. I told myself I was different because I had professional expertise the average investor lacked. I told myself my situation was different, and that's the sentence that has cost me nearly £500,000. I transferred the second tranche in February 2021. I also, that same month, agreed to co-sign a lease on a larger office space in Ratchathewi, which required a deposit of 6 months' rent paid up front. I remember the office clearly. It had a glass-fronted meeting room and a reception area where a young woman named Mintara worked. And when you walked in the first time, you thought, this is a real business. The plants were real. The coffee machine was real. Mintara was real. The business was not. Grace's mother was unwell in March. Not seriously, Grace said, but enough to require some specialist consultations that the family couldn't fully cover. I gave her 100,000 baht without hesitation. Her cousin, the one who worked in the business, needed a loan in April to deal with a legal matter involving a land dispute in the family's home province of Chonburi. 60,000 baht. I remember that because I wrote the amount down somewhere on the back of a receipt, I think, meaning to keep track of what was going out in addition to the formal investment. I didn't do that effectively. Neil came to visit in April 2021. He spent a morning at the office, met Grace and her partner, and looked at the operation with the eye of a man who'd been doing business in Thailand for 2 decades. Over lunch, he said something to me that I dismissed at the time and have since replayed to the point of exhaustion. He said, "I've seen a lot of Thai businesses, Alan. Usually, when they're doing well, they have a certain kind of mess about them. Everything here is very clean." I told him that Grace ran a tight operation. He nodded and said nothing more. He's a polite man, Neil. I wish he'd been more aggressive. The call that ended everything came on a Monday morning in June 2021. I remember it was Monday because I'd spent the weekend with Grace in Hua Hin, a long weekend that she'd organized, apparently to mark the anniversary of our first dinner. I was tan and relaxed and moderately happy. I was sitting on the balcony of the Ari apartment eating toast. The phone rang, and it was a British man named Paul, who introduced himself as the Regional Operations Director for a UK health and wellness distribution company. He was calling, he said, because his company's name and letterhead had appeared on a letter of intent associated with a Thai business venture. He wanted to know if I was involved. He wanted to know because his company had nothing to do with any Thai venture, had never issued any such letter, and had recently been made aware that their company identity had been used fraudulently in at least 3 separate investment schemes operating in Southeast Asia over the preceding 2 years. I sat with the phone against my ear for what I think was close to a minute without speaking. I remember the ceiling fan on the balcony. It had started making a faint clicking noise the previous week. I kept meaning to ask the building manager about it. I remember looking at my half-eaten toast and thinking, with a strange detachment, that I should put it in the bin rather than leave it out because it would attract ants. Funny what your brain does when it doesn't want to process what you've just heard. I called Grace immediately. She didn't answer. I called again. She answered on the 3rd call, and she was calm. She said the man I'd spoken to was confused, that there had been a miscommunication about jurisdiction, that she would speak to her lawyer and sort it out by the end of the day. She said it with exactly the same tone she'd used to explain the December banking query. Measured, professional, reasonable. For approximately 90 seconds I wanted to believe her. Then something in me, finally, would not. I went to the office. Mintara was at the reception desk. I asked to see Grace's business partner, a man named Arthit, who I'd met perhaps 4 times over the course of the partnership. Mintara told me Arthit was unavailable. I sat down in one of the chairs in the reception area and said I would wait. The look on Mintara's face as I sat down told me something. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read at the time, but which I now understand was something between guilt and pity. I called a Thai lawyer I'd been referred to by a member of the British Chamber of Commerce, a man named Korn, who operated out of a firm near Central World. I told him what I'd just been told and asked him to run an emergency verification on the company registration and associated documentation. He said he'd call me back within a few hours. He called me back within 1 hour. The trading company that I was a co-investor in was registered legitimately. The registration was real. The ownership structure was real. What was not real was the additional company that had been incorporated 3 months after I made my first investment, into which a significant portion of the Phase 2 capital had been channeled, a subsidiary I had no knowledge of and no stake in, registered in Grace's name and the name of her brother Chanat. I sat in the reception area of that office for 2 hours. Arthit never appeared. Grace arrived at the office at 4 in the afternoon. She walked in through the glass doors, and she saw me sitting there, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, her composure fractured. I caught it. She crossed the reception area and suggested we speak privately. In the meeting room with the glass walls, she did something I hadn't expected. She didn't deny it. She explained it. She told me the subsidiary was a legitimate vehicle to protect the investment from tax exposure, that it was standard practice in Thai commercial structures, that I had in fact received documentation about it that I must have overlooked. There was no such documentation, but she said it so fluently that I had a disorienting moment of wondering if she was right. Then she said, "My family worked very hard on this. Everything we built together. You knew that." That sentence cracked me open. Because what she was telling me, without quite saying it, was that the family involvement I'd understood as emotional context had in fact been operational. Chanat wasn't a warehouse supervisor candidate. He was the registered director of the subsidiary. The cousin who'd needed the loan for the land dispute was the same cousin who'd managed the fabricated shipping documentation. The mother's medical consultations, I don't know. I still don't know about the mother. I went back to the apartment and I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and my phone and a bottle of scotch, and I spent 6 hours going through every document I had. I made a list. Phase 1 investment, £120,000. Phase 2 investment, £240,000. Additional transfers, loans, contributions to family emergencies across 19 months, approximately £97,000. Office deposit and associated costs, approximately £14,000. Legal and accounting fees, now required to untangle the structure, unknown. The total came to £471,000 before I factored in the legal costs. By the time those were settled, it would be $487,000. I confronted Grace properly 3 days later, by which point I'd had confirmation from Korn that the subsidiary had been used to receive and then transfer significant funds to accounts I had no visibility of, and that the primary company's assets were substantially less than the documentation had suggested. She was angrier than I'd expected. She said I didn't understand how business was done here. She said I'd benefited from the relationship in ways I wasn't acknowledging. She said I'd treated Thailand like an opportunity rather than a place, which I thought was interesting coming from a person who'd treated me as a source of capital rather than a partner. At one point she said, "You think because you're from England, you know better how everything works. You don't." She was not wrong that I'd been arrogant. She was not right about everything else. The forensic accounting that Korn subsequently coordinated revealed a picture that was worse than I'd understood. The Phase 1 capital had been used to establish a credible-looking operation for a period of approximately 6 months, precisely long enough to show me evidence of activity and secure the Phase 2 commitment. The Phase 2 capital had been channeled through the subsidiary within weeks of receipt, most of it transferred out of Thailand entirely. Some of it, appeared to have gone into property registered in Chinat's name in Chonburi. Some had been sent to accounts in Malaysia and Singapore that Korn had no visibility into. The warehouse in Lat Krabang, the one I'd visited and touched and believed in, was rented on a month-to-month basis and vacated in March 2021, 3 months before I knew anything was wrong. I called Neil from the airport on a Saturday in July 2021. He drove out to meet me for coffee before I boarded, and he said very little, which I appreciated. He did say, "The clean office." I should have said more about the clean office. I told him it wouldn't have made any difference. I believed that at the time. I'm less sure now. I flew back to Manchester on a July afternoon, squashed into an economy seat because I was watching expenditure now, with a clarity that hadn't been available to me 19 months earlier. I had a window seat, and I watched Thailand disappear below the clouds, and I felt something I wasn't prepared for, which was grief. Not for the money. For the version of my life that I'd been living down there. The apartment in Ari with the clicking ceiling fan, the evenings on Sukhumvit, the coffee shops on Ari Soi 4, the canal at night. I'd loved it. I had genuinely loved it, and Grace had been woven into all of it so thoroughly that losing the money and losing Thailand and losing her were all one thing, impossible to separate. I'm back in Manchester now. I moved into a flat in Didsbury after selling the house in Cheshire, which I probably would have done eventually anyway, but I would have preferred it to be on my own terms. I'm 61 years old, and I have approximately £38,000 to my name. I'm doing consultancy work again, not the same level I was at before, but enough to keep things functional. My daughter knows what happened. My son knows. They've both been decent about it, which I didn't deserve given the scale of the mistake. Grace is in Bangkok. I know this because a man I know slightly from the networking circuit in Sathon sent me a message 8 months ago saying he'd seen her presenting at a business event. The presentation was about joint venture opportunities in Southeast Asia for European investors. I didn't reply to the message. I want to be careful here about what lesson I take from this, because I've seen other people in similar situations conclude that Thailand is the problem, that Thai women are the problem, that cultural difference is the problem, and I don't think that's what happened to me. What happened to me is that I took the skills that had served me professionally and I refused to apply them to the one part of the situation that mattered most. I verified the documents Grace gave me. I should have verified Grace. I trusted my emotional read of another person more than I trusted the methodology that had made me competent in the first place. That's not a Thai problem. That's an Allen problem. The due diligence I never did would have taken 2 weeks and cost perhaps £2,000 or £3,000. A background investigation company, a reference check through the Chamber of Commerce contacts, a conversation with the companies named on those letters of intent. Any one of those steps would have unraveled it before I signed anything. I didn't do them because I had separated, in my mind, the professional world where I applied rigor and the personal world where I applied trust, and Grace had been clever enough to position herself precisely on the line between them. If you're reading this, and you're considering any kind of commercial arrangement in Thailand or anywhere else, with anyone you're also romantically involved with, please hear this. The emotional involvement does not make you better at evaluating the business. It makes you worse. Every hour you spend falling in love with someone is an hour you are incrementally less capable of seeing them clearly. That's not a cynicism. That's just what love does to the human brain, and it does it to smart people as readily as it does it to everyone else. I'm not the person who left Manchester in October 2019 looking for something to do with the rest of his life. I don't know yet whether the person I am now is better or worse. I've got more skepticism than I can comfortably use and less capital than I need. I have a 35-year professional record of advising people to trust their process over their instincts, and one 19-month period in Bangkok that proves I should have listened to myself. At least I have a story to tell. That's something. I'm not sure what, but it's something.